let's come back together, and I'd love to hear, it sounds like people were having really good conversations. I'd love to hear some of the thoughts people have, observation, question. So I think Sam is running a mic around if anyone have.
What?
Yeah, she did. Thank you.
Good morning. I was just pointing myself that I think in our culture, a lot of times we talk about like grace or mercy and we look at sin that way, but just the concept of like viciously removing sin from your life or things that lead to sin. And I don't think we do that in our culture. It's kind of like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. I mean, specifically, I was thinking like Timothy initiative, like guys, whether it's shame or whatever comes about that, but we want to like belittle whatever led to that. But actually we should be like viciously removing it.
Yeah, no, that's true. I couldn't say it better myself. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, that,
Oh, yeah.
something similar. We were just talking about like what takes out leaders like in the long term, and just the idea of that, like no big deal is the enemy of holiness. And usually sometimes when we first come to Jesus, we're like vigilant. Like I got to get my whatever together, and I got to, like try to actually live a life worthy of the calling of Jesus. And then 10 years in, 15 years in, 20 years in, it's like you're faithful to your wife for 25 years and then you have the affair.
Right.
And it's like, but usually that starts with like, oh, this is no big deal.
Yeah. A lot of little things slip for.
Yeah. It's like a lot of little dominoes led to like a major fall. So anyways, and what would it look like to be vigilant? It's going to look extreme. It's going to look like, I'm not playing with this, cut it out, destroy it. I mean, it's very destructive, actually, what Jesus says. He's like, not even just like set it aside. It's like destroy the thing, and it hurts you.
Yeah.
So there's lots of depth there in that metaphor that you're like, whoa. That's non-Americanized Christianity.
Yeah, totally. David.
I hadn't really thought of it till I heard him saying that, but I was just thinking about like the connection to children, and like as we get older, we don't want to look foolish, but in order to like be vigilant in the way that they're talking about, like there's an element of feeling foolish. Mm-hmm. Like you want to feel like I'm grown up past that, or you don't want to have to like amputate your arm because your peers will be like, that's weird, but maybe that's what it requires. And just the willingness to stay that kind of humble and open to be willing to do things that look foolish to other people for the sake of some kind of like faithfulness in life.
Yeah. No, it's so true. Not only does it hurt you, it's like fairly obvious if you've cut your hand off, like people are going to notice that. So, right. Like something happened there. So yeah, how do we like be willing to not just, it's hard for us to even acknowledge our sin, like Lindsay was saying, much less like be very obvious about what we've done to correct it. It's great. Anybody else? Can you help? No. Make sure it gets you.
I don't want to lose track, too, of the fact that he calls a child first into the midst, which wasn't done by rabbis.
Right.
It just wasn't done. They were seen but not heard. They were lesser thans. But he includes them. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
And then uses them as an example of faith. Be like this child. Mm-hmm. That had to rock their world, just thinking about that.
No, definitely. I think we'll talk more about that, but it would have had more of an impact in that cultural time than it does now, where we sort of highly value children, and sometimes to a fault, sometimes make them the center, kind of. So yeah, it did.
And even going off of that, I think with the example of being a child and having your brother and sister, think of it more of like, no, this person is a child of God. So it almost it changes the shift of like, yeah, brother and sister, but also like, if I treat them like a child, I want to be nurturing to them. I want to be protective of them. I want to lead them through this. So it's like, okay, it's a little bit different.
That is interesting. Yeah, the way we interact with each other. Good.
Yeah, and to add to that, our table was talking about maybe the shift of like, it's not just us dealing with our own sin, but dealing with the fact that we might be stumbling blocks to others.
Right.
And if you're thinking of like your brother and sister in Christ as also a child of God, how are you nurturing them in their growth? And how are you being a stumbling block to their growth?
Yeah, no, that's really good. Yeah. So many good observations. Anything else? Well, maybe I will go ahead and jump in then. So in this text in Matthew, Jesus starts talking about children and referring to his followers as little ones in response to a question that the disciples asked: who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? In a similar story in Mark 9, the disciples were actually arguing with one another about who the greatest was before Jesus put a child before them as an example. And it makes me think about when we try to agree on the greatest musical artist or the greatest actor or the greatest athlete. Sometimes I think we arrive at a clear consensus, but often there's quite a debate. I remember back in the day arguments about who the best NFL quarterback was, Tom Brady's Super Bowl rings versus Peyton Manning's stats. And of course, for all my fans of the sport that the rest of the world knows as football, I've also heard of the incredible skill and creativity of Messi compared to the goal records and league championships of Ronaldo. I admit I don't have any stake in any of these things because I don't really care about sports personally, but some of you may have strong opinions about who the greatest is in this room. See, I knew somebody would probably have a comment about the soccer one at least. But we struggle to agree on who the greatest is in any given field because we're all using different standards of value to measure great. And I wonder what standards the disciples were using to determine who the greatest in the kingdom was. I wonder what standards we use, maybe without even admitting it. Do we think the greatest is the one with the clearest calling or the biggest microchurch? Is it the person who knows the scripture the best or who prays the most or leads the most people to Christ? Who do we look up to in our community? The disciples here are trying to understand something about who has status in the kingdom and maybe how to elevate theirs. And I wonder if we do that too. Fortunately for them, of course, they have the ultimate authority on who the greatest in the kingdom is, walking among them. So they ask him. And he doesn't condemn their question outright, but he does tell them and us to change and become like children, totally flipping the idea of greatness on its head and setting humility as the standard, telling us to somehow look up to a lowly child. And like Jim was mentioning, to give you some context for how children were actually viewed during these times, Roman and Greek cultures tended to view children as not being fully human yet because they lacked reason and autonomy. They were viewed as a burden that could be discarded at any time by the head of the household. In Jewish culture, they were viewed as gifts from God, but even this was more tied up with future worth or value. One day, children would enhance the workforce, add to the community's defensive power, and guarantee the future glory of their house. But children had no rights or significance apart from their future value to the family, and they were completely powerless in society. When Jesus offers a child as the example of greatness in the kingdom, he's talking about someone who is unable to advance his or her own cause apart from the help and resources of a caregiver. And in the same way, if we wish to enter the kingdom, we have to turn away from our own strength and self-seeking, our own metrics of greatness, and depend utterly on God's mercy. I think our culture is convinced that maturity means being independent and not needing anyone or anything else. But Jesus himself was a needy person. And in this text, he invites us into the neediness of children. Achieving greatness in the kingdom only happens through ditching the world's game of status altogether and becoming lowly like a child. And once we do this, Jesus starts referring to his disciples as little ones. That phrase really struck me, probably partially because I'm short and people have called me a little before. And to me, it really gives kind of this sense of vulnerability to the believers he's talking about here, sort of like what Daniela was talking about, viewing other people as children of God. But it also shows the depths of Jesus' care and affection for them. Those who receive the believers as belonging to Jesus effectively receive Jesus himself. But those who reject them and threaten them to stumble cause them to stumble are threatened with condemnation. These are some of Jesus' harshest words about sin and judgment in all of the Gospels. He has a special problem with those who cause others who believe in his name to sin, and there's a warning for the disciples themselves here too. I think, of course, he's not actually telling us to cut off our hands, but like Lindsay mentioned, we have a really hard time being ruthless with sin in our culture. And so I do want to kind of spend some time unpacking a little bit what Jesus is saying here. So I do have a gross story. I apologize. A couple of weeks ago, one of my fingers actually got really infected because I bite my nails and I'm a toddler mom who's doing gross things all day long. So I was trying to decide whether or not to go to a clinic for it. And I told my husband, Eric, I was like, I will happily take any antibiotic they give me for this, but I am not too fond of the thought of them having to lance and drain the infection. A few days later, I was sitting at a clinic watching a nurse practitioner gather all her tools to puncture a hole in my infected finger, which I have not even wanted to touch or look at for days at this point. So I'm just sitting in that chair thinking, is there an excuse I can make to just leave right now? I want to run. I want to get out of here. Maybe I can deal with the pain and the swelling and possibly losing this finger. Obviously, I knew rationally, and I did stay and my fingers flashing. I knew rationally that draining the infection would give instant relief and facilitate the healing process that needed to occur. But part of me, wanted to just live with it rather than deal with the momentary pain. And I wonder if sometimes we do this with temptations to sin too. There are certain thought patterns that we know lead us to sin. There are ways the world tells us that we can be great that directly contradict Jesus' call to change and become like children. Our phones and our computers provide us with a host of these temptations, a temptation toward anxiety as we Google symptoms incessantly, to covetousness and jealousy as we scroll through Instagram, to anger and defensiveness as we read posts on X. The media we consume tells us that being great means looking a certain way, having a certain political or social ideology, making a certain amount of money, living at a certain standard. The institutions we're a part of tell us that being great means knowing more, buying more, doing more. Maturity is seen as being independent and I think cynical, not needing anyone and not trusting anyone. We're under a constant barrage of different value systems for greatness, and these temptations can overwhelm us in just the same way that an infection overwhelms our bodies. We don't ruthlessly cut it away. I recently read a book by a guy named Alan Noble called You Are Not Your Own. And just a funny side note on this, I was looking for the book again to reference it. And on Amazon, when I start searching You Are, it suggests the title You Are a Bad Bleep, which you could use your imagination. If you search You Are Not, you get You Are Not Broken. And on the Public Library's app for books, it suggests a range of titles because it doesn't actually carry this one. And the third one in the list was Living Your Best Life Every Day. So just looking for this book that has kind of a countercultural title, it was like a little tour of all the temptations the world has to offer. We're tempted to believe that we are what we do or have or what others think of us. And we construct false selves based on this rather than on the truth of our neediness and dependence on God. In You Are Not Your Own, Noble talks about this through the lens of the I just need to phenomena. He describes our sense of weariness, urgency, and moral burdening when we learn of a new technique for living. Maybe it's an article outlining strategies for raising well-adjusted or successful children, a journaling method that promises to bring order to your chaotic life, a new Bible reading plan, self-care routine, or organization method that you just need to do so you don't have all these problems, so that you can be great in your life, in the kingdom, in your own strength. I just need to can also refer to a task that you need to complete. I just need to wash these dishes, or I just need to respond to this email, or I just need to have this conversation, just to give you a glimpse of my day. Noble says that for the total work addict who swears, I just need to, a life of order and balance and peace is just a pretense to excuse more striving. And he points out that this worldview does make sense if you belong to yourself. But if we are helpless children who belong to Jesus, only able to enter the kingdom of heaven by depending on the grace of our Father, then this ceaseless striving is actually a temptation to sin. And if we don't deal with this temptation, this infection, we can end up giving into pride and seeking greatness by our own means, no longer living as little ones or relying completely on God's mercy. Our lives and leadership in these cases may look great, but they're actually missing the kingdom. And as leaders, if we disciple people in this way of thinking, we actually lead them away from the kingdom too. I was actually teaching in kids' church a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about temptation too, so it's been a bit of a theme lately. And I was talking to the kids about idols, so I asked them to kind of list some things that sometimes feel more important to them than Jesus. I thought we'd be talking about Bluey or Spider-Man or favorite stuffed animal. And there was some of that, but there was also a 6-year-old who said, being safe. And I was like, oh snap, me too, actually. And then I felt convicted because how long does it usually take me to admit or maybe even realize that I've made being safe more important than following Jesus? Sometimes the more resources and education that we have, the more grown up we are, the harder we have to work to get past what we think we know, to understand our own souls and the heart of Jesus. The more stuff and ideas that we accumulate, the more we're tempted to rely on those things. But the poor and children, anyone who experiences some level of physical powerlessness, remind us of the helpless reliance on God that we are all called to. If we're measuring greatness in our own strength, though, we might try to take this away from these little ones. With good intentions to help them learn and grow, we might lead them towards striving and self-reliance. How do we instead disciple people to be like little children? Jesus obviously isn't saying that in order to enter the kingdom of heaven, we have to hate broccoli or throw temper tantrums or refuse to do our homework. So how can we instead learn to emulate the humility, the dependence of children? We've been talking a lot lately about being a day one community, and it doesn't get much more day one than being a literal baby. When babies are first born, their vision only extends about 6 inches in front of their face, which is kind of the same for me if I take my glasses off. So it's just far enough to look into the face of a parent or caretaker as they're being cradled to their chest. And when they're not sleeping, babies are staring at this face in fascination. And as they gain control of their own facial muscles, they start imitating expression. In the 1990s, scientists discovered a group of special neurons that fire both when an individual completes a certain task and also when they notice someone else performing that same task. Originally observed in monkeys, mirror neurons have been found in humans too, and are thought to play a significant role in our childhood development. Mirror neurons are likely why an infant that's just a few hours old can mimic the gesture of sticking out their tongue when they see someone else do it. They're how kids learn to wave, clap, use utensils, just by observing and imitating others. And they're even thought to play a role in language acquisition. So before my son Gio was born, I had a few conversations with Eric about not overly exposing him to our kind of extreme nerdiness. For those of you that know us, I was afraid that he would reject it and try to be cool, and then that would be really sad for us. This is partially why we decided to do a space-themed nursery instead of going all out and just doing Star Wars. But people know us, of course, so we got a lot of nerdy toys and books and clothes for him, which I love. I'm not mad about it. And I think Kristen actually gave us our first Darth Vader toy, which I just put in his room from the time he was really little. And when he was probably 6 months old and he would reach for it, I would do the Darth Vader breathing mask noises. As you do, oh yeah, that's Darth Vader. And so in the last couple of months, we've started noticing that when Chia plays with that toy or reads one of his Star Wars books or looks at our Star Wars kitchen towels, he starts doing this. Sherry, can you play that video, please? He's doing the little, what I was doing, the little. You guys can ask him who Darth Vader is after service, and he might do it for you. But the first time he did it, Eric was like, what the heck? How did he learn to do it? And I had to confess that I probably taught him that just by being myself. And now he wants to read one of his Star Wars books, I think the one he's reading in that video, every night before bed. And this is mirror neurons at work. This is how kids learn, through fascination and imitation of the people in their lives that they depend on. This is discipleship. I believe that humility is formed in us when we gaze at Jesus the way a newborn child gazes at its parent. When we are fascinated by him, always watching to see what he's doing in the world and trying to imitate that. Of course, kids often get things wrong when they first start imitating others. I think Gio's been in this phase of gaining knowledge but not really understanding how to apply it also. So he figured out that when we blow on hot food, but he doesn't know which foods are actually hot, so he'll blow on his Cheerios sometimes. He knows that I use my keys in the door, so anytime he grabs them, he takes them to the front door and puts them, just the car keys, in the knob, which is not quite. But he isn't worried about looking silly in these moments. He's experimenting, trying to figure out how best to imitate the people in his life that he depends on. And I think that we need to be like this as missionaries. We need to experiment and pivot as we try to figure out what Jesus is doing in our neighborhoods or our schools or our offices or the parks that we frequent. If we're less concerned about being great by the world's standards and more concerned with gazing at Jesus in fascination and imitating him, we won't mind taking these risks and sometimes getting things wrong. A lot of you know that Eric and I have been hosting game nights for our nerdy friends for quite some time now. And a couple of years ago, we were starting to kind of feel like conversations were stalling and people aren't really showing up. I think during the pandemic, this community got even more comfortable just kind of staying at home, playing games online. But we did have a couple of friends express that they really wanted a space to have conversations with real humans in person. And we were excited about that. So I bought a deck of these like healthier together conversation cards because I felt like we still needed a bit of a format. And we would go around in a circle and someone would pull out a card and read the question and we'd all discuss it. And that kind of worked for a little while, but it still felt a bit awkward and forced. And then eventually people stopped coming to that as well. So I think at that point we were both kind of ready to give up on the project. But I felt through the Underground's prayer room last summer that Jesus was calling us to still be faithful. And Eric had an idea during Summit that maybe we could host nights where people actually bring like creative projects that they're working on, because a lot of our friends are into that kind of stuff too. So we would invite people out to, and they could bring their coding or their crocheting or they're planning for a D&D campaign or whatever it is that they're working on at the moment. So nerdy, I'm sorry. What can we do? Well, so we didn't know if that would work or what that would really look like. We didn't even know what to call it at first. I think we've since settled on Make Nights. But those events have actually been really cool. We've had like a decent amount of people at all of them. It's a real mix of people who are following Jesus and who aren't. We've seen people collaborate on projects together and have good conversations. And we've been building deeper relationships with more spiritual questions. And that space kind of felt like blowing on Cheerios at first. So as we grow in our walk with Jesus and our lives as missionaries, we can't forget to be fascinated with Jesus and to experiment and take risks in imitating him. These things act as an antidote to the world's temptation to be independent, cynical people who rely on our own strength and striving without needing or trusting anyone else. They remind us how helpless and dependent we actually are on Jesus, as powerless as children. For my last point here, I want to read you this quote from G.K. Chesterton. Because children have abounding vitality, because they are in spirit fierce and free, they want things repeated and unchanged. They always say, do it again. And the grown-up person does it again until he is nearly dead. Sure, grown-up persons are not strong enough to exult in monotony. But perhaps God is strong enough to exult in monotony. It is possible that God says every morning to the sun, do it again. And every evening, do it again to the moon. It may not be automatic necessity that makes all daisies alike. It may be that God makes every daisy separately, but has never got tired of making them. It may be that he has the eternal appetite of infancy, for we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we. Brent, if you want to help me close. I want to give us a little bit of time to respond to this and maybe just take some time to think about ourselves as children. It might be hard to even remember what that was like, but I just want to kind of, take a moment to close your eyes and try to imagine yourself as a child now in the presence of God. Let go of the ways that you come to him guarded, the ways you unconsciously try to impress him with your righteousness or achievements. Just take a moment to be still before him with no program or agenda, picturing yourself as a child. Kind of anxieties or worries to have now that you did it back then? Can you identify some of the ways you're tempted to operate in your own strength? Where are you striving and coming up short, saying, I just need to, and filling in that blank without Jesus? Whether that's in your microchurch, with your family, your job, or your school. How is God inviting you to be like a child again?